Hello and welcome to the webinar on SharePoint Interventions Prevention. My name is John Frost. I'm the CTO at Jack Frost Design. Jack Frost Design has been involved with SharePoint from the beginning, building over 75 intranets and portals since 2003, including a nominee for Best Intranet of the Year for Cricket Communications Corporate Portal. But enough about us. We're here to talk about SharePoint. Just to establish some background, SharePoint is the world's leading intranet platform with an over 80% market share when it comes to the development of corporate intranets, extranets, records management systems, and workflow automation. But there are some issues, and that's what we're here to talk about in today's webinar, the 5 keys to preventing SharePoint project failures. The first thing that you need to understand is that, unfortunately, most SharePoint projects are not initially successful. From 2013 to 2016, the percentage of initially successful projects has increased, but only to 11%. By the way, this is according to a survey of the project managers who led the SharePoint developments. Those same project managers realized that SharePoint isn't the problem. Less than 8% consider replacing the platform after a project failure, and only 1% actually do. That's right, 99% of the time they rebuild the project using SharePoint. The majority of SharePoint intranets are rebuilt 3 times before the organizations are satisfied enough to keep what they've built. Fortunately, the survey went on to ask those project managers to identify the reasons for the failure of those projects. The first reason, quote, senior management didn't endorse it and enforce it, unquote, I kind of dismiss. That's because if the intranet actually provides value to the user, saves them time, makes their job more efficient, makes their life easier, you don't have to enforce it. After that, we find that all of the other reasons boil down into just 3 categories: poor planning, poor structure, and little or no training for the users. We see inadequate user training, didn't do enough planning and scoping, users never really liked it or found it hard to use, which I'm translating into lack of training, not prepared to invest more in extending it. We don't have the expertise or IT resource to move it on. I'm also kind of translating that into a lack of training again. Project teams like it, but it's not used much elsewhere. I can see why, if the intranet is poorly planned and implemented, and without training, that project teams would still be interested in it because it delivers such an incredible benefit if your job is to implement projects. So I could see these people going out of their way to learn how to use it on their own. But let's set that aside for now. Then we have users have drifted away to other tools. Well, people are going to use what they know how to use. They have jobs to do, and they've got to get them done. But this speaks to poor training again. And lastly, we have become somewhat locked into earlier versions. Again, without training on the new platform, people are going to use the platform that they know how to use. So you can see that this boils down to issues related to planning, the structure of the intranet, and training. That brings us to the second key to preventing SharePoint project failure: planning. Goals and scope are required. Typically, high-level goals driven by return on investment are not created by senior management. The project is delegated to a technical team prior to the establishment of clear business goals. Senior management and the project team members are inexperienced with SharePoint. This results in over-deployment and unnecessary complexity because their efforts are not focused by a set of goals driven by return on investment. Third-party products are purchased to provide functionality that's already present. They just didn't know it could do it. Lack of a coherent vision causes confusion when blueprinting and architecting the site collection. The project will then exceed its budget and timelines without producing tangible results. What's required is a detailed goal statement based on return on investment that clearly identifies the purpose of the project. And then there needs to be a companion scope statement that keeps the project focused from a technical and feature perspective. In order to establish the goals, you need to understand the purpose. Is it a content management system with record retention policies? Is it a corporate communications portal that's supposed to educate and motivate employees? Is it a third-generation site that's now going to start implementing workflows, business intelligence, or even records management? The more clearly that you establish the goals for the intranet, the easier it is to build one quickly. Planning meetings proceed more effectively because you've established what the intranet is going to be. and just as importantly, what it's not going to be. That brings us to the scope. Where the goal statement establishes what the intranet is supposed to do and achieve, the scope statement establishes the technical limits to how the goals are going to be achieved. Will you allow third-party products? Are you going to allow workflows in this phase? Are you going to support future records management by establishing content types for your documents initially? What are the limits that you're going to establish for branding? Does it need to be ADA compliant? Does it need to work on mobile devices? Establishing a clear goal and scope statement initially provides an effective bracket for the project. Everyone knows what the project is supposed to do and the technical limits for how it's supposed to do it. That brings us to the third key point for preventing a SharePoint project failure: planning the structure. The project must be architected and blueprinted. Many SharePoint projects fail because the SharePoint architect was not involved to create a blueprint detailing the site collection and each of the involved sites. Wireframes for individual sites detailing the web parts and the functions were not created. Without blueprints and wireframes, there was no plan to guide the building process. This means that during the build process, there's an endless series of meetings to review what's being built as it's being built, with major changes being implemented during the building process. So the process runs over budget and exceeds the timelines. You end up with an uncoordinated site collection with conflicting sites. So user navigation and adoption of the site collection becomes increasingly problematic. What's actually needed is for an experienced SharePoint architect to design the site collection based on the goal and the scope limitations. You need a blueprint detailing the site collection and each of the involved sites, individual site wireframes detailing the web parts and functions, and a document that identifies the lists, libraries, and functions for each site, as well as a permissions worksheet identifying who the site owners will be and the security groups across the site collection. This is what a real site architecture blueprint can look like. It identifies the sites to be built and their position in relation to one another, which is designed to create a logical, easy-to-navigate intranet. The companion wireframes for the individual sites identify what features and functions are contained in each site, where they're located on the page, and what they're supposed to do. Establishing up front the templates for the sites that will be used in the site collection allows you to standardize on site layouts, which is going to make it a lot easier for the end users to know how to operate different sites as they move from one site to another inside the site collection. This kind of continuity is enormously helpful for the end users. Having a blueprint for the site collection and wireframes and templates for the individual sites also means that the process of building the intranet is one of assembly, not discovery. Successful SharePoint projects have the majority of their time spent in planning, not building. The actual time required to build an intranet like the one you see diagrammed in the blueprint here would be just a few weeks. All of the hard work as to what to build, how it will work, was already established during the planning phase. A key component to planning the structure is to create a site collection specification that details the names of the sites, their URLs, the names of the libraries and lists. It also needs to be detailed as to the site owners and the permission groups that are able to visit each site. Imagine building a large intranet without having these requirements already documented. The idea is to document all of this before the build so that you don't have to constantly stop in order to reconvene a meeting to answer a question. That brings us to the fourth key to preventing a SharePoint project failure: training. Training is required at all levels. Unfortunately, the typical approach is that senior management and the project team members develop goals for their intranet without the basic knowledge of what SharePoint is and how you use it. The same is true of the line of business managers and the IT department. They often lack even basic SharePoint training, and yet they're the ones building it. Then come the end users, who probably don't receive any direct SharePoint training because it's so expensive. And so only a small percentage of end users will receive direct training, and they'll be expected to train everyone else using the train the trainer model. That brings us to the typical results. Without knowing what SharePoint can do, if goal and scope statements are created, they're going to be awkward and inefficient. The capabilities of the individual sites are stunted due to ignorance of the available features and functions. Expensive third-party products are regularly applied when they're completely unnecessary. Most end users receive no direct training and cannot function in the environment. The project fails because it's difficult to navigate, doesn't provide benefits to the end users who don't know how to operate it anyway. What's actually required is for senior management to receive some training in SharePoint fundamentals before they design the goal and scope statements. The project team and IT need to receive SharePoint training, and they need the support of a SharePoint architect that's built several successful intranets previously. And all of the end users need to receive direct training, not just a handful. If you think that providing SharePoint training to everyone, from senior management through IT down to the individual employees, is price prohibitive, it is, but only if you rely on instructor-led training. Most large organizations now employ on-demand video-based training curriculums composed of a series of short segments. This way individuals can be trained for a few dollars per person as opposed to hundreds of dollars per person. The image that you see here is an iAssist training site that Jack Frost Design normally deploys into our SharePoint intranets. The purpose of this site is to provide both initial training and ongoing support via a complete curriculum of short videos. We also normally train a client senior management team in SharePoint using these videos before they create the goal and scope statements. That brings us to the fifth key to preventing a SharePoint project failure, and that's making sure that your team is supported by people that have experience in implementing successful SharePoint projects. As was mentioned earlier, typically senior management is setting direction with no SharePoint experience. IT takes responsibility for the project with only 1 or 2 days of SharePoint administrator training, which is more about how you set up a SharePoint farm, not how you build an intranet that makes business processes more efficient. And no one on the project has ever experienced a truly successful, well-adopted SharePoint intranet. Without the appropriate experience and skill sets, the team is unable to conceptualize, design, and deliver an effective SharePoint project. It's like asking a group of intelligent people to design and build a car when none of them knows how to drive and no one has ever seen a car before. Microsoft recommends a team of individuals representing specific SharePoint skill sets in order to build a successful intranet. An architect, a business process analyst, a front-end developer, a back-end developer, and a trainer, not to mention a project manager. Today, with a lot of people moving their email to the cloud, they automatically find themselves in possession of SharePoint. Front-end development and back-end development are now relegated to Phase 2 or Phase 3 of a SharePoint development, but an architect and a business analyst that have experience with SharePoint is indispensable. As we've mentioned just a few moments ago, generic automated training is now so affordable that everyone on the team and in the organization should be trained. In summary, most SharePoint projects fail. You need precise goal and scope statements in order to design a structure. The structure must be architected and blueprinted before you try and build it. Training is required at all levels, and previous successful SharePoint experience is required by the team. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and if you'd like to know more, our website contains additional details about all of the topics that we've discussed today. But if you have a project on the drawing board or in the doghouse, let's talk.